Anthropological archaeologists who work in the Middle East, as we said before, like to focus on big picture anthropological questions. And this is related to some of the changes that we see over time in the Middle East and the different kinds of economic systems. So an economy, as you probably have learned from anthropology, is simply the production, distribution, and exchange or consumption of goods. So you can have a subsistence economy, you could have a trade economy, you could have a craft production economy. But different changes that we see over time in the Middle East, archaeologists try to look at the origins and development of these changes, such as agriculture, agricultural systems, pastoral nomadism, right? So not just the domestication of animals, but then the herding of those animals and the development of people who base their subsistence mainly on the herding of those animals, like sheep and goat or camels. Religious changes, so the movement from what we might call paganism, right, belief in many gods, polytheism, to Zoroastrian kind of religion, to Greco-Roman, then to Christianity, and to Islam. Ethnicity is a very difficult question to look at archaeologically because, again, what are you going to base it on? Pottery styles, or are you going to try to base it on language groups? While at the same time, you have lots of ethnic mixing in the Middle East. But lots of interesting questions arise from that. So we have, I believe it's still being taught, an anthropology of migration class in our department. Ancient migrations is something that archaeologists like to explore. And in prehistoric times, the way this was identified was from the appearance of different pottery styles that we know originate from a specific area. We're going to be looking at those kinds of questions. So migrations of people. And so again, we want to know not just where something happened, but when it happened, and then also to look at why. Let's look at the different environmental zones of the Middle East. Some geographic terms to keep in mind. The Levant. This is the Levant right here, the Eastern Mediterranean, comprising Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and part of Syria. Even you can see a small area of Turkey up there as well. This Eastern Mediterranean coast is typically called the Levant. Then Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is essentially the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So we're talking about portions of southeast Turkey, northeast Syria, northern Iraq, and then down into southern Iraq and portions of southwest Iran as well. All right, we're going to look at different environmental and cultural zones. Now, how does the environment, or how does an environment in general, not just in the Middle East, influence history and influence human development and human culture? Well, it's important to think about it a certain way. The way that the environment would be looked at in the 1960s by some anthropologists would be that the environment determines what's going to happen. And that if you know what the environment is, you can determine how people are going to behave. And we know this is not true. But certainly the environment has a big influence. The environment really sets up opportunities, things that people can do. There's certain things you can do in certain environments, and there are certain things that are impossible, constraints for human cultural development. Right? So, for example, in a very hilly area that gets enough rainfall for agriculture, you can grow a certain amount of food, but maybe you won't be able to irrigate because it's too hilly and it would be too hard to get the water from the river to your agricultural area. So you have opportunities to grow food based on rainfall, but you cannot irrigate to produce even more crops if you wanted to. We're going to see this is true of northern Mesopotamia, but not southern Mesopotamia. Right? So it's not environmental determinism. Environmental determinism is believing that once you know the environment, you can determine how people will behave. And it takes human agency out of the equation. But really, the environment sets up opportunities, and it also sets up constraints. So things you can do, things you cannot do. Okay, what about topography? Topography plays a big role as well, and also climate. Right? Climate as in the amount of rainfall and the types of vegetation and animals that exist there. So topography, where mountains exist, where low-lying areas exist, will determine trade routes or help influence the development of trade routes. For example, people living, let's say, at the juncture of what develops as east-west and north-south trade routes will have an advantage over other areas in terms of trade. So mountains are passable in certain areas. They are impassable in other areas. If you happen to be living in an area which is one of the few areas to traverse a mountain range, such as the Taurus mountain range or the Zagros mountain range over here, you will have an advantage in terms of trade versus, let's say, other people. So topography will influence trade. Topography will influence, let's say, strategic locations. We also have to look at the impact of humans on their own environment. We know throughout the world that humans have had negative impacts on their own environment. And we see the same in the Middle East through domestication and domestication of animals made in many areas of the world deforestation irreversible. That is, those domesticated animals, once trees were cut down, any young trees that start to grow back would be eaten by those domesticated animals, and so trees would not grow back. Irrigation, if you over-irrigate, especially in a very hot area, the moisture in the canals, the water in the irrigation canals evaporates and leaves behind minerals and salts in the soil. And over time, these salts build up until you can get to a point where the salt is so high that the land is unusable at that point. Erosion, right? Deforestation leads to erosion. As I showed you in some of those pictures, there are areas that used to be forests that are now completely deforested. Some of the rich topsoils in those areas were washed away and have not returned. Right? Ancient people used wood a lot for firewood. If you're cooking every day, if you're firing a kiln to fire pottery and things like that, you're going to use a lot of wood. And so in areas where they used up all of the wood, what they would then use as a substitute, and this is done even today in the Middle East, is dried animal dung. And it works well. And if you have no wood, this is really the only alternative that you have to starting a fire and keeping a fire going. So what they would do is just take the dung from animals, and they would let it sit in the sun, and it would be completely dried out, and it would actually burn quite well. Okay, so as we talked about before, topography, the landforms, the mountains, right, help define the environmental zone. They're going to determine, in some cases, the rainfall. That's part of climate, right? The rainfall and the temperature. And then we also have vegetation. Right? So let's look at the Middle East in general. All right, the Middle East has these two mountain ranges, the Taurus over here and the Zagros over here, and the Levantine Mountains you can see over here, partially because this is the meeting between the Arabian and the Eurasian plates, right? So these continental plates are actually butting up against each other, which also produces earthquakes. So we've had some severe earthquakes in Turkey and also in Iran in the past decade or so. Again, we said we have the Levantine coastal range, this mountain range, the Taurus region over here, and the Zagros over here. I've attached on Blackboard a couple of maps that you can use to take notes on if you want, to sort of help you remember these areas. Some of the basic zones like the Taurus mountain range, the Zagros mountain range, where the deserts are, where the alluvial areas are, as we're going to look at, are important to be able to recognize on the map. But at least you'll have some sort of association with those areas, right? That is, you'll see pictures and you'll hear me talk about those areas. It's not like, for example, when my daughter was in middle school, she had to memorize these blank maps, locations and capitals of countries, without any association whatsoever with the country. So just blank white sheets of paper with shapes on them, having to memorize the countries associated with those shapes is very difficult. But hopefully you'll have something to associate these locations with, so they'll be easier for you to remember them. You won't have to memorize them because the exams will be open note as well. But it'll help you as we're learning about different areas. If you have this in the background of your mind, you'll remember, I remember this is the area where there's rain, this is the area where there's not rain, etc. Right? So the foothills of the mountains, because the predominant winds kind of move this way from west to east, they carry moisture from the Mediterranean in this direction. When they hit the mountain ranges, rain tends to fall right at the foothills of the mountain ranges over here. Right? And this is the Fertile Crescent. This is the area where there's actually, I'm sure many of you have heard that expression before, the Fertile Crescent. This is where there's enough rainfall for crops to exist without irrigation. And so this area over here, the foothill areas, you will have enough rainfall because the winds carrying the moisture hits the mountains and then the rains fall in these regions. This area over here is very dry, desert-like conditions. These areas over here, right, are connected by the Tigris and Euphrates, and especially when you get to southern Iraq, you have marshes and you have natural canals that connect the system. This is a very watery system, as we'll see. Very, very flat. You can see there's very little topography down here. Okay, so topography, as we said before, will determine, or at least influence, lines of trade and communication. So old ancient trade routes typically follow the Taurus Mountains east-west, the Tigris and Euphrates river systems north-south, and then there are also certain passes like the Khorasan Road that goes through the Zagros to central Iran, or the Cilician Gates, which allow people to access the uplands, the Anatolian Plateau. This is Anatolia right here, sometimes called Asia Minor. This is the modern-day country of Turkey, right? So Asia Minor, Anatolia, modern-day Turkey right here. Over here we have Syria. Right? Next to Syria, just to the east, is Iraq. And just to the east of Iraq is Iran. I remember when I was a graduate student, my first year in graduate school, had a nice professor who did his doctoral work in Iran. Really nice guy. And I remember in class, I talked about Iraq and Iran. And after class, he took me aside privately, and he said, they're not really pronounced that way. That's the way, presidents have pronounced them. But the way you're supposed to pronounce the countries is Iraq, not Iraq. Iraq and Iran. So he was nice. He didn't embarrass me in front of everybody else. But he did take me aside and say, you're mispronouncing the countries. Yeah, so Iraq, Iran. And then here's Jordan over here. You have Arabia over here. We don't have the rest of Arabia going south. We have Israel. We have Palestine, Gaza over here, Lebanon to the north, right? The coastal part of Syria, which is part of Syria proper. You can see over here. Those are the major countries that we're going to be looking at, right? But we've got, again, the portions of Anatolia here, and we have the Zagros Mountains over here. Okay, so topography influences trade. It influences rainfall. You also get a lot of rainfall, not just here in the Fertile Crescent, but also, we're not going to be talking about this area too much, but the Black Sea coast gets a lot of rainfall. It's interesting when you see areas in Turkey on the Black Sea. It's thick, dense, green forest. Not what a lot of people would expect when they hear the term Middle East. There's lots of different, as we're going to see, environmental zones in the Middle East. Okay, so the best areas for agriculture are early agriculture, the Fertile Crescent. In fact, the earliest agriculture and the earliest evidence for agriculture is in the areas of the Fertile Crescent. Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, southeast Turkey, and parts of northern Iraq. And parts of Iran as well, that Fertile Crescent area. That's where you have rainfall. Okay. You get, the minimum that you need, which is about 250 millimeters a year is what you need to be able to grow the kinds of crops like wheat and barley, which are some of the most important crops. The seasonal differences in the Middle East are different from what we expect. Their harvest season is different. Right, we usually think of big harvest in the fall. That usually we when we think of harvest time, we're thinking the fall. But actually, in the Middle East, harvest is in the late spring. That's their big harvest time for wheat and barley. So holidays and festivals in the Middle East, in terms of harvest festivals and things like that, are different from what we're used to in the northern climate. So rain falls mainly in the winter. So you would plant in the late fall. You would get, things would grow during the winter as you got a lot of rain. And then, so you'd plant in October, around then, and you'd harvest May, June, and July. And this is when crops like wheat, barley, peas, lentils, chickpeas, things like that would be ready to harvest. And this is a wheat field in Syria. You can see and someone harvesting by hand. Okay, let's look at some of the environmental zones. We could classify them in terms of coastal areas, mountains, and plateaus, right? Very high altitude areas like the Anatolian Plateau, uplands and foothills like the Fertile Crescent, alluvial plains near rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, and deserts. So let's look a little bit with some pictures what these areas are like.